IVM.
Hey everybody, welcome to another week on the IVM Podcast Network. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Paytm Money Upfront. Guys, we're heading into week 2 of the lockdown, and I'm sure it's been challenging for all of you, just as it's been for us. We're doing our best to make sure that we maintain our schedules, but beg your indulgence if we slip. In the meantime, if you're looking for more stuff to listen to, might I suggest you go dive into the archives. We've got over 6,000 episodes of content we've created over the last 5 years, and I'm sure there's something in there that you'd love listening to. Anyway, stay safe, and let me get you started with your show.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti, and today I have with me Pranav and Aditya Ramanathan, and we're going to be discussing the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, or the NPT, there was supposed to be a review conference that was going to happen in New York at the ending of April till the ending of May. And what happens generally in these conferences are that hundreds of representatives from a large number of states that are party to the treaty, I think there's 191 or so today, actually come down to New York, and they cap off a 5-year cycle of meetings through which they're constantly reviewing implementation and compliance with the treaty. So, Aditya, over to you. Can you give us a little bit more context on what exactly the day-to-day administration of the treaty looks like? So my understanding of it is that there's constantly a lot of organizations, a lot of people in the background who are going about inspecting, negotiating. What exactly do these people do, and what is the point of these review conferences?
The NPT is really at the very heart of the nuclear weapons architecture, legal architecture of the world. So everything that, we talk about the Nuclear Suppliers Group, for example, it's very much an outcome of the NPT. The NPT is really, like you said, it has 190 countries. One of these, it used to have 191 countries. The country that got out of the treaty was, of course, North Korea. There is some speculation, of course, that Iran might also at some day in the future also step out of the treaty. But that's for the future. That's for a later date. There were 3 critical countries that didn't sign the NPT. Those were India, Pakistan, and Israel. Another country, South Africa, it moved towards accession in 1991 and gave up its nuclear weapons as the apartheid regime fell. So the NPT is basically, it very explicitly divided states into haves and have-nots. And by the time it came into force in March of 1970, that's exactly 50 years back, it divided countries into nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. So even today, as a legal definition by the NPT, today there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, but there are only technically 5 nuclear weapon states, which are the 5 members of the Security Council, namely the US, the UK, Russia, France, and China. India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea are, for all practical purposes, of course, nuclear powers, but they're not called nuclear weapon states. This, in a sense, gives you a sense of how the NPT is sort of, it's really for a treaty from another era. It really had its origins in another time, in the middle of the Cold War, at a time when nuclear testing was rampant. It had only been a few years before atmospheric testing had been stopped by an agreement, and a comprehensive test ban treaty was not in place, so countries were still testing underground. So this is it's a treaty from another time. And while these review conferences are meant to reinforce the commitment to the NPT, they've become more and more empty in their promise, because the NPT was predicated on the idea that the nuclear weapon states would at some point start moving towards abolition. Obviously, that was not going to happen, and it's not a commitment that was frankly made in good faith. And we certainly aren't any closer to it today.
Okay, that kind of makes sense. So given the fact that the NPT originated in this totally different era, though, what really was it aiming to achieve in this year's conference, Pranav?
So in this year's conference, they started preparing for the conference as far back as 2016, when they started having various preparatory conferences and setting up the agenda, the rules of procedure, and so on. The agenda this time was to focus more on implementing non-proliferation measures, trying to curtail the new arms race that's happening between Russia, China, and the United States. And more importantly, there was a focus on prohibition of nuclear weapons, which was a treaty that was signed in 2016 in the UN General Assembly, but it did not come into force. So these three were the large agendas they were supposed to discuss. The 2015 conference ended in a catastrophic failure almost, as none of the countries were able to come to any sort of an agreement on any sort of a joint statement. So this time it was also very pessimistic because the agenda was not set correctly. There was confusion on whether the Middle East and Egypt and the Arab group would bring back the point of Middle East nuclear weapons free zone and so on. So in this conference, there was really a push for trying to get the nuclear weapon states to make certain guaranteed commitments for disarming. According to the Article 6 of the NPT, the nuclear weapon states, the 5 nuclear weapon states, are supposed to pursue in good faith negotiations towards a disarmament, right? So there was a strong push towards that. There would have been. But we don't know now what the agenda will be next year. It all depends on the circumstances. We also know that the last standing arms control treaty will come to an end in early March next year. So if the conference is postponed by 1 year, it will all depend on whether the US and Russia will choose to extend the New START treaty or not.
So Aditya and Pranav, both of you mentioned a very interesting term. Aditya, you said that the nuclear powers had agreed to eventually disarm in bad faith. And Pranav, you mentioned that the idea was that the nuclear powers will pursue negotiations in good faith. Can you tell us a little more about the original context within which this idea first came about? Right? It seems to me that it was a product of a very particular historical time and space, and the fact that Russia and the US are still so important to the way the treaty looks today is probably indicative of the original shape of the nuclear world. So Aditya, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, really the NPT has its origins in 1945, really right after the first nuclear explosions went off. What happened after the war was the Americans set up a man named Bernard Baruch. Bernard Baruch was a Wall Street financier, and he came up with something called the Baruch Plan, which, just to put it very simply, meant that that the United States would eventually give up its nuclear weapons and its nuclear weapons making capabilities once an inspection regime was in place to make sure that other countries did not have such programs of their own or would dismantle any incipient nuclear programs. Now, you can imagine how other countries reacted. The Soviet reaction to this was quite simply, how about you Americans actually first get rid of your nuclear weapons, then we can have this inspection regime for everybody. As far as the Soviets were concerned, the Baruch Plan was really about maintaining the American nuclear monopoly for as long as possible. Remember, right after 1945, the Americans underestimated the Soviet capability to race towards the bomb. The Soviets got there in 1949, so the American nuclear monopoly eventually lasted only just about 4 years. But the Baruch Plan is really the idea at the heart of the Baruch Plan, which is that the existing nuclear weapon states are supposed to commit themselves to disarmament, but before they move towards that, they want to first make sure nobody else is developing nuclear weapons. And in a sense, the NPT is the Baruch Plan writ large. It is an agreement among thieves, in a sense. They're basically saying, all right, let's just make sure nobody else has these nuclear weapons, and then we'll figure out what we want to do or say about ours.
Yeah. So, but the NPT by itself actually came in a much more better form. In 1957, an Irish foreign minister named Francis Aiken launched the NPT process because he truly believed that disarmament was very important for the world, and he believed that the superpowers could actually agree on disarmament. There was another problem called the Nth Country Problem, which was being studied by academics individually. Nth Country Problem was, if there are 30 nuclear weapon states by the end of 1970, what's going to happen in the world? How is the United States going to deter all these countries? So, because of these tensions, the NPT negotiation process really began in 1964, and by 1968 they had a plausible treaty. Just a fun fact here is that while USSR, and UK were firmly entrenched in the negotiations, China and France, who are also listed as nuclear weapon states, did not become members of the NPT till 1992. So they stayed away from the treaty because they thought that they would have to negotiate in good faith towards disarmament. So for the first 40 years or so, you didn't have two nuclear weapon states as a part of the NPT at all.
Interesting. So that gives us a sense of what was going on up till 1992. But what was the next big development in the world of nuclear non-proliferation?
The next big development was in 1995. They had the Npt Extension Conference. Now, in the Npt Extension Conference, there was a doubt about what is the future of Npt. Now the Cold War is over. Should all the nuclear weapon states start disarming their nuclear weapons? And there was already that environment. The START treaty was already signed between the US and Russia, which significantly cut the number of nuclear weapons that both sides had. And they had extremely good inspection and verification regimes. So the natural thing was that these countries would significantly disarm to triple-digit and double-digit numbers of nuclear weapons. Instead, what happened was in 1995, the Extension Conference decided to extend the NPT indefinitely, meaning that there was no clear end to when the treaty would actually come to a close. So they had institutionalized this regime where 5 countries could own nuclear weapons indefinitely, while the other countries would have to go through this very, very arduous process of withdrawing from the treaty and then trying to build their own nuclear weapons, which is sort of the reason why you had North Korea, which was cheating within the regime. North Korea withdrew from the NPT in 2005, but they were actively cheating under the regime where they were hoarding fissile material way back as 1995, 1996.
Oh, okay. That's. I didn't know that North Korea had been active in that space that
Yeah.
early.
Yeah. But if they'd actually chosen to formally withdraw from the treaty before proliferating, they would have faced significant setbacks and they would have faced significantly more sanctions. So they decided to cheat on the treaty instead.
So this actually brings up a really interesting question, which is how effective has the NPT been? Now, we've been fairly critical of it so far on this episode, but if you listen to proponents of the treaty, they'll say it's a very imperfect treaty, but it has really been effective in inhibiting countries from acquiring nuclear weapons, from pursuing nuclear weapons programs or dual-use programs. And they will say it has done so in a few ways. One is simply by denial. What happened, one of the things that the NPT created was these institutional mechanisms. There was initially something called the Zanger Committee in the early 70s, which is really a nuclear exporters informal agreement. And this was, and later it's...
Was their job to deliver zingers?
Yes, that was exactly it. And it's been largely superseded by the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which of course we know much better now. And these export control mechanisms have theoretically prevented a lot of dual-use technology from going to other countries. There have also been other export control regimes, understandings that have technically prohibited this. As Pranav also really pointed out, the very fact that you have to withdraw from this treaty in order to go for full-on pursuit of nuclear weapons means that there is a further barrier. There is a normative barrier. You might face ostracism from other countries. It might affect your relations with other countries. It might affect your trade. So it creates obstacles in the way of acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, the counter argument to that would be that irrespective of the hurt that maybe sanctions can cause you, you'd probably be willing to take that pain if you really, really needed nuclear weapons. And so while the NPT has probably had some effect in this regard, I think we should point out that it's had a fairly easy time for the simple reason that not all countries really want to have nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are expensive to develop, to manufacture. Nuclear forces are expensive to maintain, and they're not necessarily this magical replacement for your conventional forces. So there are a lot of reasons for countries, rational national security reasons for countries not to acquire nuclear weapons. And I think that, in a sense, giving credit entirely to NPT, it's almost as if the proponents of NPT are actually reaffirming the value of nuclear weapons. It's paradoxical. But one thing about the 95 indefinite extension was, of course, as Pranav pointed out so clearly, this basically meant that these countries were not even pretending anymore that they would give up their nuclear weapons at a future date. And this, right after this, came the CTBT, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And this, again, there are a lot of good things about the CTBT. Even preventing the superpowers from testing again is actually quite an achievement. The problem was that for countries like India, it put them in a dilemma. Either you test now, or the international pressure on you, basically the news tightens. And in 1996, India had actually planned to test nuclear weapons. The test preparations were detected by American satellites. There was pressure on India. In 1998, of course, India took much.
That's very interesting. I don't know about the 96 thing.
Yes, and India needed investment from abroad. It was not in the position that it was, say, a few years back. So India caved in 1996, and in 1998, India made greater preparations. There were more precautions. They figured out how to evade American detection, so that there wouldn't be pressure on the government. And they tested on May 11th and 13th of 1998. And so India's own nuclear tests, quite interestingly, are also very much a reaction both to NPT and the CTBT. Yeah, I would not necessarily say that the NPT has been entirely successful in that regard.
I completely agree with Aditya. The funny thing is that once both India and Pakistan tested, initially India and Pakistan both faced heavy sanctions. But after that, what happened was the US really started negotiating on lifting these sanctions against India and Pakistan quite significantly. Stuart Talbot, for example, came to India, negotiated quite significantly, and got most of the sanctions removed. So the message that they were sending was almost like, if you signed the NPT, you got yourself into this problem yourself. Look at these intelligent countries. They never signed the NPT and they get to have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so absolutely. Critics of the India-US nuclear deal, for example, would basically say that the US has gone and carved out a big exception for India in the NPT. There is some truth to that, but I just want to stress that India's civilian reactors are still very much open for inspection. It's only its military nuclear facilities that have basically been firewalled away. But I will definitely say that the US-India nuclear deal has been one of those developments that have reduced general faith in the NPT all over the world. I'm not necessarily sure that that's the worst thing that can happen. The NPT is in fair amount of shambles today, and while it's held on to dearly by people in the arms control community, especially in the West, I think there is an broader understanding that we need to look to other means of thinking about nuclear arms control and about nuclear restraint. One example we're seeing of this is the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was voted on in the UN General Assembly in 2017. And it's really a whole bunch of countries, of non-nuclear weapon states, basically coming together and trying to prohibit nuclear weapons. And what's really interesting is that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, those 5 nuclear weapon states as per the NPT, have completely ignored this.
Aditya, I also feel that the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is much more flawed in the sense that it only offers to say that countries should disarm nuclear weapons are illegal, they are banned. But it does not provide any alternative security measures, or it does not even address significant security concerns of countries, right? You have verification prohibition measures, but it does not address the concern of delivery systems. It does not address the concern of dual-use systems. It does not even address the concern of fissile material and non-testing. It just provides lip service to the CTBT, and it does not have any significant measure to say that countries should not even conduct certain kinds of tests. So even if you consider the treaty as a standalone agreement, it's flawed in many, many ways.
Absolutely, I agree with you. We are actually at a critical juncture where the NPT review conference has been delayed. New Start is under a cloud. We've had the loss of the INF treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Arms control has generally failed, and there are very few new ideas about what we can do about it. One idea, of course, that we at Takshashila have been promoting is the idea of a global no first use agreement. With the hope of at least getting countries to start talking about what no first use might mean, what it means in terms of their own security and threat perceptions. I hope that conversation continues in the future, because talking about nuclear arms control, or at least restraint regimes for nuclear weapons, will only grow in importance because we simply have 9 nuclear powers today and not 5.
Okay, I think that sets us up very well for April 2021. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and thank you guys for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Welcome to Peak Planet, a new podcast where we delve into the fallouts of the growth path that we, and indeed much of the world, has chosen. Sustainable growth is the buzzword. Until we nail that down, we need to ensure that we keep our population healthy and also have the resources for our increasingly urban lifestyles. I'm Karthik Ganesan, a researcher at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, a Delhi-based policy research institute where for almost a decade we've been trying to explain and change the use, reuse and misuse of our resources. In the first season of Peak Planet, we take up air pollution, public enemy number 1 and an invisible one at that. Increasingly, the most important risk factor for adverse health outcomes, air pollution has become the most unwanted byproduct for an aggressively growing economy. Over 4 episodes, we find out how prepared our systems are to deal with this crisis. You can catch the entire first season of Peak Planet out now on the IVM Podcasts app or website, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Hi, I'm Sarayu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And we are the hosts of the Ganatantra podcast.
On this podcast, we speak to academics, social scientists, journalists, and activists to find out what's actually going on in Indian politics.
On this podcast, we stay away from personality politics, intrigue, and gossip, and instead focus on the data, research, and analysis that drives all this.
So tune in to the Ganatantra podcast, where new episodes are out every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.